Hey, what's going on, everybody? It's the CD guy, Johnny Z here. Thank you so much for tuning back into the channel, and today I'm going to be counting down 10 great rock and metal bands that should have been bigger and discussing the possible reasons as to why they weren't. Also, be sure to stick around to the end of this video for a pretty controversial number 1 pick. Kicking us off here with my number 10, I'm going to go with Metal Church, and, Metal Church are one of the most respected bands in heavy metal and have a core following as well, and when you listen to the music, it's very much debatable whether or not they're a thrash metal band, but there definitely are some thrash metal elements in their sound that allow them to hang with the best of them in thrash metal, and, one example of this is in 1986 when they opened for Metallica on the Master of Puppets tour, right, and, as for why they weren't bigger than they turned out to be, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that they were never looked at on the same level as bands like Megadeth or Anthrax or Slayer, and were eventually overshadowed by the bigger bands to come out in the 90s in the mainstream, and eventually drowned out by grunge and alternative at that same point as well. So I think those factors definitely are attributed to the fact that they were not bigger, but I always felt like they were a band that were destined to be bigger than they ended up being. But that being said, they do have a great catalog of heavy material and a core following, so I guess it didn't turn out all that bad for Metal Church, but they're a band that I always felt should have been a lot bigger than they ended up being. Mother Love Bone were one of the most important rock bands to come out of the Seattle music scene in the late 80s and early 90s, and seemed to be on the precipice of superstardom alongside groups like Nirvana and Soundgarden, until in 1990 their lead vocalist and frontman Andrew Wood passed away due to a heroin overdose, and the band released their debut album Apple anyway, but really couldn't offer much after that, and it's very unfortunate because, number one, Andrew Wood was an extremely talented and promising young musician, and also because Apple is a tremendous debut album, and really shows what Mother Love Bone were capable of as a band, but they discontinued following Andrew Wood's passing, and like I said, really couldn't offer much following the death of Andrew Wood, so they did disband, and it's just a shame that they could not back it up with future releases because Apple is a great album, and Andrew Wood was an extremely talented musician who passed away way too soon. So coming in at number 9 here, I'm going to go with Mother Love Bone, a great band that I feel was on the verge of superstardom had Andrew Wood not passed away, unfortunately, due to a heroin overdose. Following that up with my number 8, I'm going to go with Gentle Giant, one of the most respected prog rock groups of all time, and it's really a shame that they never got their time in the mainstream like bands like Yes or Genesis did, and I think the biggest reason for that is because unlike Yes or Genesis, Gentle Giant really never went through a phase where they made their sound mainstream accessible, and this is something that the band themselves even acknowledged on the sleeve of their sophomore studio album Acquiring the Taste, saying, and I quote, "It is our goal to expand the frontiers of contemporary popular music at the risk of being very unpopular. We have recorded each composition with the one thought, that it should be unique, adventurous, and fascinating. It has taken every shred of our combined musical and technical knowledge to achieve this. From the outset, we have abandoned all preconceived notions of blatant commercialism. Instead, we hope to give you something that is more substantial and fulfilling. All you need to do is sit back and acquire the taste." So this is something that, like I said, the band has come to terms with and acknowledged, and that's really good, but it's just a shame that as a band they never got their time in the mainstream. But one encouraging thing is that over the last, I'd say, 15 years or so, I think the music has really aged very well, and they've really started to get their due respect more recently than anything else, as they weren't that big in their prime. But Gentle Giant, like I said, one of the most respected bands in prog rock who are just now, over the past 20 years or so, starting to get their due respect in the prog rock community, but a great band nonetheless, and definitely belonging here on the list. Coming in at number 8, I'm going to go with Gentle Giant. Coming in next at number 7 here, I'm going to go with Armored Saint, a group fronted by John Bush that were one of the pioneering bands of the LA metal scene, and despite releasing an excellent debut album in 1984 titled March of the Saint, the group would start to crumble in 1987 when they were dropped from their record label, and in addition found themselves in quite a bit of debt for many years as a result of over-budgeting on their debut album. And I feel that all this, mixed with creative differences throughout the band, really led to the group not reaching their full potential, and I think they were a band with all the tools to be huge, but just kind of fell by the wayside in the mainstream and would eventually get eclipsed by bigger metal bands to come out of the LA scene during that same time period. So coming in at number 7 here, I'm going to go with Armored Saint. Like I said, they had all the tools to be huge, but just unfortunately crumbled as a result of over-budgeting, creative issues, and things like that. My pick for number 6 here on the list, Rose Tattoo, are no-nonsense, no-thrills, down-to-business hard rock band from Australia, very much in the same vein as the 70s works of AC/DC. So when saying that, you do have to ask the question, how come they weren't bigger and reached the same success as AC/DC? Well, I think one of the reasons as to why they didn't is because maybe they were too similar to AC/DC and didn't really offer anything different to record labels at the time that AC/DC didn't already have covered. And even though they do have a pretty big following in Australia, the Rose Tattoo really aren't prominent anywhere else in the world. And I do think maybe a case of being too similar to AC/DC, if that makes any sense, does have something to do with that. And another reason as well is their frontman, Angry Anderson, might not have the same crossover appeal as the AC/DC frontman Brian Johnson does, and it's very telling how in 1980, when Brian Johnson joined the band, his addition really did help to propel the group into the mainstream, to the North American audiences, and I just feel like Angry Anderson doesn't have the same crossover appeal to really help propel the band into the mainstream in North America. So that being said, I think Rose Tattoo are a great hard rock band, and I definitely do appreciate their work, seeing that they are very similar to AC/DC, and I love that no-nonsense Australian hard rock sound. But as for being a band that would be bigger in the mainstream, they never were that group, unfortunately, and I do think part of that does have to do with them being maybe a little bit too similar to AC/DC in that regard. Moving on now into the top 5, I'm going to go with Savatage, one of those underrated heavy metal bands of all time, and in the 80s and 90s, they released a number of great records, including this album here, Gutter Ballet, also Streets, a Rock Opera, and Hall of the Mountain King, which are excellent heavy metal records, and dare I say might even be metal essentials, but they're a band that, in my opinion, really never realized their full potential. I think one of the reasons why is because of their frontman, John Oliva, who was a tremendous singer, but unfortunately might not have had enough mainstream appeal to carry the band to the next level. And also, as much as I love Savatage, I think they're a great band who made a number of fantastic, enjoyable records. They really weren't doing anything differently at the time that other groups weren't doing, other bigger bands, I should say, weren't doing as well. So they really didn't offer any major record labels anything different, or, fans as well in the mainstream anything different that bigger bands weren't offering. But in the 90s, with Zachary Stevens on lead vocals, after John Oliva departed the band, they would make some more commercially accessible music with albums such as Wake of Magellan and Edge of Thorns, but unfortunately it was too little too late, and they were swept by the wayside. But the good news is many members of Savatage went on to form the Trans-Siberian Orchestra, and together they have achieved worldwide acclaim. But in my opinion, like I said before, I feel Savatage are one of those underrated metal bands of all time who really never got to realize their full potential, regardless of who was the lead vocalist for the group, whether it be John Oliva or Zach Stevens. Two great eras of the band, but all in all, they're a band that, like I said, really never realized their full potential. For my number 4, I'm going to go with Queensryche, and they're a great band that, in my opinion, peaked in 1990 with the release of Empire here. Great album, but unfortunately it came out just before the music industry would change forever, with the rise of grunge and alternative really taking shape in 1991, and by 1994, when Queensryche released their next studio album, a lot of their fans had moved on, and the music industry had changed, with Alice in Chains, Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, and Nirvana attracting most of the attention. And, it's interesting because, like those bands, Queensryche are from Seattle, but they never really did catch on quite as much as those other Seattle bands did, due to the fact that Queensryche came up years earlier and had really paved their way in the progressive metal genre rather than the grunge genre with those other bands. So they didn't have quite the same appeal, even though they were from Seattle as well. But they're a band that I feel their biggest creative blow came in 1998 when Chris DeGarmo departed the group. He was their lead guitarist and primary songwriter, and without Chris DeGarmo in the band, that left Jeff Tate to really steer the sinking ship that was Queensryche, in my opinion. And we all know the story about Jeff Tate and the ugly breakup, the dysfunctional breakup between Jeff Tate and Queensryche. But they have seemed to have bounced back now with Todd Latour on lead vocals, and I actually got the opportunity to see Queensryche live with Todd Latour when they were opening for Judas Priest on the 50th anniversary tour, and I think they're great live, but it's unfortunate that they peaked in 1990 with the release of Empire here before the music industry would change forever and they would be swept by the wayside. Breaking into the top 3 now, I'm going to go with Skid Row, and this entry is pretty interesting because Skid Row were at one point at the top of the world following the release of Slave to the Grind, their sophomore record, which saw this album charting at number 1 on the Billboard 200, becoming the first metal album to do so, and they were on top of the world, right? But by the time of their next release in 1994, grunge and alternative had taken over, and the band were pretty much drowned out by other bands like Nirvana and Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains, you know the groups, but that seems to be a recurring theme here for a lot of entries on this list, is that they were eventually overshadowed by a lot of the more popular grunge bands at the time, and that's a shame though, even though that I like a lot of those grunge bands, a lot of these really talented metal bands eventually got overshadowed and ignored because the world was focusing on Seattle at the time, But I think the biggest blow to Skid Row came in 1996 when Sebastian Bach departed the group, and even though Skid Row has tried their hand with a number of different vocalists over the years, I feel they never reached the same level of success or greatness as they did with Sebastian Bach on lead vocals. Bach is a great vocalist and a perfect fit for Skid Row, and like I said, they never really reached the same level of greatness without him in the group. So coming in at number 3 here, I'm going to go with Skid Row, a great band that unfortunately peaked in 1991 with the release of Slave to the Grind and really couldn't recover from the rise of grunge and alternative. Next, at number 2, I'm going to go with one of my favorite bands of all time, and that is W.A.S.P. I love this band to death. They're in my top 5 favorite groups ever, but I know exactly why they weren't bigger, and that's because W.A.S.P's early lyrical content and shocking onstage antics gained the band notoriety and attention, but in the long run, it turned out to be the wrong kind of notoriety and attention, and, even though they were right in the middle of Tipper Gore's war against heavy metal, so were a lot of bands, so it's not really something that you could say that's remarkable about W.A.S.P, and, due to their shock rock image and unpredictability, they weren't as marketable as other groups to come out of the LA strips, such as Rat or Motley Crue, and, in addition to that, it's unlikely that a major record label would take a chance on W.A.S.P, considering that they were deemed so offensive at the time, and it's unlikely that a major record label would sink a lot of money into W.A.S.P, knowing that their records could be pulled off the shelves at any time because they were deemed so offensive by the mainstream at the time. But W.A.S.P are one of my favorite bands of all time, and I think Blackie Lawless is an absolute musical genius, and regardless of which iteration of the band or what era they're in, I think Blackie's always surrounded himself with incredible musicians, and I can't wait to see W.A.S.P live later this year when they come to North America for their 40th anniversary tour. That's going to be awesome, but I think W.A.S.P were definitely a band that should have been bigger, but that being said, I know exactly why they weren't. It's because of their shock rock image and their unpredictability, which really, I think, kept a lot of major record labels away from investing a lot of money into their product. Before I get to my number one, I do have a handful of honorable mentions that I want to give out. So, honorable mentions here go out to Overkill, Alcatraz, Riot, and Flotsam and Jetsam. All great bands that I feel should have been a lot bigger, but I can only fit 10 on the list here today. Like I said before, my number one pick here would be a bit controversial, but if you allow me to elaborate, I promise I can make sense of it. So that being said, coming in at number one here, I'm going to go with Guns N' Roses, and, I know GNR are one of the biggest and most well-known rock bands of all time, and still play stadiums to this day, right there, worldwide superstars, but I feel that their prime was cut short due to substance abuse, due to infighting throughout the band, and lineup changes as well, that really cut their prime short, and, if you look at their catalog, and albums like Appetite for Destruction, and both Use Your Illusion albums, the group showed moments of absolute brilliance on those records, but just imagine how much stronger their catalog would have been had they continued to release records throughout the 90s, and, had they continued to follow the natural progression of their sound. I feel that they were moving in the innovative direction that would have put them on the same level as Rolling Stone's greatness, in my opinion at least, and, that way they would have continued to fill their catalog with consistent music and compelling music as well that followed the progression of their sound, and instead they fell apart and the band showed their self-destructive nature, leaving Axl Rose to pick up the pieces and really carry GNR for a number of years, and I think that they could have released more classic records as a band had they continued to follow that path and not self-destructed, but it probably would not have made much of a difference from a financial aspect, as they're still one of the biggest bands in the world despite, not releasing a great album since Use Your Illusion in 1991, but think about it from a legacy perspective. GNR could have cemented themselves as one of the most respectable rock bands of all time had they continued down that path and not self-destructed, and like I said, from a financial aspect, it probably wouldn't have made much of a difference, but from a legacy aspect, I think GNR really could have cemented themselves as one of the most respectable rock bands of all time, but that's not how the history of GNR unfolded, and unfortunately they would self-destruct, and it is good now that they've reunited with Slash and Duff McKagan has Axl Rose, but I feel like their prime has passed, and GNR missed a real opportunity over the years to release some more compelling music following the natural progression of their sound had they not been so self-destructive. So for those reasons, I do feel like they fit on this list, even though, like I said, from a financial aspect, they probably would have been just as successful. So that wraps up my list of 10 great rock and metal bands that I feel should have been bigger, and hopefully I made sense of my number one pick. But if you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel down below, and we just hit my goal of 500 subscribers, which is great. And I'm so happy that we are halfway to 1,000. I am so humbled and flattered by the support, and over the last month, the growth on the channel has been amazing. So thank you so much to old subscribers and new for your continued support. It's greatly appreciated, and the 500 subscriber special will be coming up soon here on the channel, so you definitely want to stay tuned for that, and turn on the bell for notifications so you don't miss it, and every other future upload here on the channel. Also, be sure to leave a comment down below. Did you agree with my list? Did you disagree with my list? And what are some great rock and metal bands that you feel should have been bigger? Let me know all that good stuff down in the comments below. And until next time, it's the CD guy, Johnny Z, signing off. Take care, everybody.